My name is Rikeyah Lindsay. I'm a survivor justice advocate with Straight Ahead. I am the lead organizer for our Survivor Justice Network. I'm going to be the facilitator tonight. We have some amazing panelists. I'm going to get into their bio in just a second. But a little bit about who I am and what the Survivor Justice Network is. I'm a dual survivor. That means I have multiple experiences with violence. And I might be a triple survivor, right? I live in a community, number one, that is heavily impacted by crime and violence. I have lost several loved ones to violence, unfortunately. And I also have a loved one who is serving a virtual life sentence for a violent crime. I'm not unique, which is the sad reality of many people living in Philadelphia and other impoverished areas, right? Like many people can say that they know someone who has, who has been a victim of violence or have been a victim of violence themselves. I guess I should also share, I'm also a domestic violence survivor. But also, right, this invisible line where we also know people who have been harm causers, right? And so the point of the Survivor Justice Network is for those of us who do have these experiences, who have lived them firsthand, for us to be able to take control of our narratives, for us to be able to share our stories in our words from our perspectives, and then for us to be the ones who determine what justice and healing actually looks like. Right now, we are functioning within a system that kind of tries to speak for the survivor. They like to call us victims. However, we're still moving forward. And so I like to use the term survivor. And they get to be the judge and jury. They get to tell the story and they get to impact and decide how things play out. They get to tell us what justice looks like, even when it doesn't necessarily correlate to justice for us, right? I can say, right, we live in the United States, which is the leader in mass incarceration. And if that was, quite frankly, the answer to justice or safety or healing, then we wouldn't also be one of the leaders in violence throughout the nation. And so today's panel discussion is meant to kind of, take us into some different thought processes about what safety, what healing, what justice actually could look like, for us to reimagine and redefine what that can mean for us. And so with that, I want to pull back for myself a little bit. And I am going to take this moment to introduce our amazing panelists. I'm very excited to introduce these panelists. We have Noam, and Noam, please help me pronounce your last name correctly.
It's Keim.
Noam Keim is a master's in arts and the reentry and diversion manager at the Center for Carceral Communities at the University of Pennsylvania, where they oversee court programs as well as general programming. They design programs that center trauma healing, self-agency to support people in actualizing their potential. Noam moved to the United States from France and they have spent the last decade supporting people inside prisons and courtrooms. Their work is guided by abolitionists and healing justice frameworks. They strongly believe that we heal through relationships and collective support and accountability. Prior to working at the center, they coordinated the Mentor Court Program and worked at Congresso, where they supported underserved youth and immigrant adults. Outside of the office, Noam is a community herbalist and a nonfiction writer. Their first collection of essays, The Land is Holy, is forthcoming with Redix Media in 2024. Welcome, Noam, and thank you for being here. Our next panelist is Felix Rosado. Felix is a co-founder of Let's Circle Up, a restorative justice project created at Bradford State Prison in 2007. While incarcerated, Felix also co-coordinated the Alternatives to Violence project and led several other justice and peace building initiatives. In 2016, he earned his Bachelor's of Interdisciplinary Studies degree from Villanova University. Felix spent 27 years fighting a death by incarceration sentence, from which he escaped in 2022 via governor clemency. He currently serves as program coordinator for Healing Futures, a youth restorative justice diversion program with Youth Art and Self-Empowerment Project in Philadelphia. Welcome, Felix. Thank you both.
Thank you, Ricky.
Thank you so much for agreeing to participate in this panel tonight. Your bios are super dope, but I also want to, again, like I said, pull back and give you both some time to introduce yourselves before we jump into the question and answer portion of tonight. So Noam, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Rikeyah, for introducing us, and Felix, I'm excited to talk with you. Before I tell you about myself, I feel that it's important in this moment for you to name that as I'm speaking, Gaza is being bombed with the
complicity, 2 Pepsis and 4 Mountain Dews.
With the complicity of the American government. And I'm not taking this lightly as somebody who was born in the Zionist state and who carries that passport and was chosen for the last 10 years to not cross BDS lines. And with that being said, I will post a link after I'm done introducing myself for you to call your representatives to ask for a ceasefire so that we can avoid this genocide in the making. With that being said, I would want to say that my whole career comes out of my anti-Zionist beliefs. I believe that carceral systems, including prisons, immigration systems of destruction, borders, are all connected and all creating the same harm. And so I moved to the US 10 years ago. And at the time, when I moved to Philly, I could not work because I didn't have a green card. And I spent my first year in the US working at Books Through Bars voluntarily, where I send books to people who are in prison. And that's actually how I got connected to this work. These days, what I really focus on doing is supporting people in healing from trauma. As myself, however many victim you want to think about, somebody who has survived a lot of violence and was also like enmeshed in the violence of the American empire. And so that means that my days are spent supporting people who have committed harm, but who are also being harmed by systems. And that looks like a lot of different things, right? My day job, I do group therapy with people. That's what we do at the center, free group therapy with no barriers. That's available to anybody impacted by the system. That means, doing case management and supporting people in basic needs. And also it means making medicine, herbal medicine for people so that we can all also be nourished and support each other as we move through this movement of collective liberation for all of us. And maybe I will end my introduction of myself here and pass it on to Felix.
Thank you, Noam. That's hard to follow. I appreciate you naming what you started with, and that call to action, which is really important. And I didn't know that you worked with Book Through Bars. That's an interesting detail. I'm pretty familiar with them.
I probably sent you some books at some point.
Yeah. I mean, they're a lifeline, especially to people in solitary confinement. So the bio said a lot. I don't want to repeat any of that. I grew up around violence my whole life, in my home, in my neighborhood, in my school. Just couldn't get away from it until I started participating in it myself. At age 18, I went to prison for a murder and got sentenced to death by incarceration. I was sent to prison to die. Because of a miracle that happened last year, I'm here sitting with you all today, and I consider myself extremely blessed for that. I also currently work in a youth restorative justice diversion program, and I spend my days trying to keep as many young people out of the system as possible, which is really rewarding to me, really important. And I get to go to work every day and step into a time machine and talk to my younger self, and see if I can give them some of what I didn't get growing up. So I do that work, and I'm also an unapologetic abolitionist. So I'm doing a lot of work around trying to end the sentence I was fighting, death by incarceration, but also prisons in general. They are the direct descendant of slavery. They're inherently dehumanizing, disempowering, and racist. And we need to find better ways of addressing harm in our communities. And so that's the work I do.
Thank you both. I just want to say, like, I'm very honored to be sharing this space with you guys. And so if you don't mind, I want to kind of just jump into it. So you're both on this panel for different, but almost like kind of the same reasons. Noam spoke to healing justice. Felix, you work in restorative justice. And I was wondering if both of you could give a little background about what those different, like what is healing justice, what is restorative justice, and what are the guiding principles of each of those different forms of justice. Whoever wants to go first.
Are you getting us started, Felix? No, it's me. Okay, I could do that.
Okay, good. Go for it.
All right. So healing justice, the first thing that I should say about healing justice is that it's a framework that was really thought and designed by Black Southern queer women. And so very, like, I want to name that lineage of there's no liberation without Black queer feminism. Get with that program. And it really started, with the Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective. And the idea of healing justice is to think about generational trauma and violence, right? And thinking about the ways that we can heal as communities and how our movements for liberation need to be healing movements too, right? And that's as much as we want to go into more, I will say masculine ways of fighting for collective liberation, actually also tending to our bodies, to our trauma, to our healing is really important. And so that brings in modalities such as, therapy, meditation, yoga, acupuncture, herbal medicine. And I don't want you to think that it's like a hippy dippy thing where we're just, bringing crystals into the place. It's actually the idea that if we center, because health and healing in the United States is tied to racial capitalism, right? So racial disparities and money and, all the different structures of destructions of the US. And so bringing healing into that model allows for us to think about interrupting intergenerational cycles of violence from a collective standpoint, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you, Noam. That is really important. That work is really important. Restorative justice, the current field of restorative justice, I should say, emerged in the 70s, but it is derived from indigenous traditions that go back many, many generations. And essentially, it's a way of doing justice that seeks to heal by involving those who were directly impacted by a harm, including those who caused it. So it puts everyone in a space to talk about what the needs are and what needs to happen to put things, as we like to say, more right. The guiding principles are many, but a few are that we are all interconnected, that every human being has inherent dignity and deserves to be treated with respect, and that when we harm each other, we have an obligation to make things more right. And so going off of those principles, there are several practices that attempt to accomplish this, circles, different kind of conferences that bring people who were harmed together with people who caused the harm to work things out. And this can be done in connection with systems or apart from systems. It can be done in schools, in churches, in homes. It's often said that restorative justice is something that could be done at the kitchen table. So that's it's a people process, and some would say it's quite frankly just common sense. When you hurt somebody, you're obligated to do something to fix it, which isn't what the current system does at all.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like I heard both of you mention the word collective. And even to your last point, Felix, about how the current system doesn't really take into account an actual, I'll say the word accountability, right? Like that process. It's not necessarily present. Like the system speaks about holding people accountable. However, when there is an outside force naming, right, who did the thing and what the punishment for the thing looks like, as opposed to thinking about, I know some of the guiding questions for restorative justice, right? It asks what, rather than who did it and what should the punishment be, right? It's what harm was caused, and I'm gonna need what are the exact words? I know it's what harm was caused, and I want to say like how can it be healed, but I know healed is not it. It's um. So can you elaborate on it?
Who has been harmed? What are their needs, and whose obligation is it to meet these needs?
Right. And so can you speak more to what that looks like as a collective process, both in terms of healing justice and restorative justice? And Felix, I'll let you like take that one first, if that's okay.
Yeah. Well, you brought up accountability. And for most people, accountability is just synonymous with punishment and prison. We hear all the time people jumping on the news saying, yeah, this person needs to be held accountable. This person needs to turn themselves in and be accountable. Accountable. We hear it all the time. I would argue to anyone who's willing to have this debate that prison is the antithesis of accountability. Because first, accountability has to start with truth. And the system as it currently functions promotes deceit at every stage, encourages deceit at every stage, and punishes truth-telling. So we all know from, watching any of the primetime propaganda dramas on TV that if once you get the cuff slapped on you, you start telling the truth, you're going to find yourself in a lot of trouble quick. So what most people do is say they didn't do it, create some other story, blame someone else, find some way to minimize the punishment, whatever. And on the other side, the people trying to lock you up are cutting every corner they can and telling every lie they can to get that conviction. And it goes on and on and on. You know, to have to fight for your freedom sometimes means just doing whatever you have to do. So often people create alternate narratives of what really happened, and internalize those over years and years and years of fighting for freedom. Restorative justice creates a space where people can just be honest, where people can talk about exactly what happened, what the thinking was, what the feelings were, and you know, healing can only come from that. It has to start there. So I'm actually forgetting the rest of your question, but you were asking about what this process looks like
in the collective form and why that's necessary.
I mean, restorative justice, for the most part, is about healing interpersonal harm between parties. But most practitioners, and I can definitely speak for myself, are fully aware of the systems and institutions that shape us and oppress us and lead us to this harmful behavior in the first place. So it's important for me to always have an eye on that and to be working towards a society where people's needs are met and where less harm is taking place. But the restorative justice process specifically looks to bring about healing between people and specific harms.
Noam?
I was going to assume that you were going to ask me the same question, so I was just going to jump in if that's okay. Yeah, I think that like I want to give you a little bit of background about what I do at the center so that you all can understand my understanding of collective work. So at the center currently, so we run group therapy that's free, open to everybody, but we also run a gun diversion program that's the first of its kind. That's not really, you know, out there in the world because it's a pilot, but it is a diversion for people who are charged with possession of a weapon that's unlicensed. They haven't used the weapon, right? It's a gun that doesn't have a license. In most places in the US, it's a misdemeanor. In Philadelphia, it's a felony charge that carries a 5-year probation charge, right? Giving you that context. So we have this diversion program where people agree to come to the center for 6 months, work with us. And at the end of the 6 months, if they're doing well, their judge feels like they're doing well, the charges are withdrawn, right? Well, they're now processed and then the case can be expunged. So they just don't have a record anymore. And so what people agree to do is to come to group therapy weekly and then build a relationship with a case manager. I don't use that term, and I don't use the term therapy with my participants either, right? We just we enter a relationship. And what's really important for me in the work that I do is that's actually at this point, we have been able to back up with data, which we haven't released yet, but we're starting to see the first like seeds of that, is that the people who come to my work to receive supportive services, when we look at their life experience at the beginning of their journey with us, they have what we call really low attachment. So I don't know how people are familiar with that, but attachment is the way we develop relationships with our caregivers, and this is the way that then like then we are in relationship with other people, right? And so for a lot of us, we already know that in Philadelphia, data is pretty clear. A lot of the young people in our city are really wounded, really traumatized from a really young age. And that often means that their attachment style is really disorganized. That means that usually they're not able to trust people. They, you know, they have a hard time having like stable, healthy relationships with people in their community. I think that I'm not blowing anybody's mind by saying that, hopefully. What we have seen is that in the course of the 6 months of people coming to us and being in this therapy space, which is, you know, it's a group. Our group, the way it works is that every week we ask people, what's up? How you doing? And people talk, and people can talk with each other, like the model that Felix is describing. Because this is a clinical space, we have like complete confidentiality. People can say whatever. They can tell me that they're still selling drugs. They can tell me that, like, you know, they can tell me whatever, right? Obviously, there's the rules of social work. If they want to kill themselves, kill somebody else, that's a different story. But you know, and we have ways of dealing with that without the police being involved. Anyways, what we see is that at the end of those 6 months, our clients are able to have healthier relationships. And that's because they have spent 6 months in relationship with people and with us as social workers. And in a way where they feel safe, secure, and we're supporting them not just with therapy, but with meeting their needs. A lot of people don't have their needs met. Sorry, I have a weird cough. You know, food, rent, jobs. And so we can talk about our feelings all day long. At the end of the day, if somebody is hungry and sleeping on the street, we're not going to go anywhere, right? But if we're able to build relationships where there is accountability, like you were saying, Felix, right? Where for me, the way I describe my work with my clients is I will love you unconditionally. Will I like you every day? Absolutely the fuck not. Will I tell you when you're doing stupid shit? Absolutely, right? And that's the part of the accountability, right? It's not just like this hippy dippy thing of being like, oh, you're great and you're, you know, I just want to support you unconditionally. No, I want to do that. But at the same time, when you make decisions that are dumb and that are harming yourself and other people, I will be the first one to tell you, right? And when people learn what it looks like to be in a loving relationship that's accountable, they start building this muscle for relationships. And when people build the muscle to have relationships, they reduce their tendency to harm people because they actually understand what it means, because they're in relationships with other people and not just this feeling of being alone on an island and there's nobody that they're accountable to, if that makes sense. And so there's a lot of, like, obviously, I also want to name for everybody here, healing justice and restorative justice. It's not like we're like on opposite side of an aisle and we're like fighting for, you know, different models. It's actually things that are really aligned, right? And it's like different arms of the same goal and the same idea, right?
I love that. Well put.
Yeah, I agree. And I also want to bring like transformative justice into the space, right? Because I feel like healing justice, restorative justice kind of go into transformative justice having a grounding and understanding that that violence is rooted in the harm that comes from overarching systems, right? And I feel like you both spoke directly to the fact that there are systems in play that create the circumstances for harm to happen within communities, right? And then again, these systems then become judge and jury, and they actually take no accountability for what happens in society, although orchestrating at the same time a lot of the harm that goes on. I feel I lost the thought.
Well, I can continue that thought if that's okay.
Yes.
I do feel like this is really important. Like, I feel like Felix and I work with individuals who are often being punished for structural issues. And I feel like that's something that when we're talking about violence in this city, I do want to point out, because it's like there is obviously responsibility for our own actions, and there is a structural reality to the fact that like 1 in 14 Black people in Philly are under supervision, right? That is not just like something that magically appears. We are at the heart, like Philadelphia is the heart of the carceral empire, right? And you can see it in every system of the city: housing, schools, health, etc., etc., etc. We also know that somebody who's caught in the system and who catches a case will be more likely to, guess what, go back in the system, right? And so the ways that often we need to prevent violence is to resist with all our like might and like strength for people to go into that system, because once they're in the system, it's so much harder to get them out, right? And maybe one thing that I want to name in like this structural thing so that I can ground it for people. In trauma studies, there is this thing that we call the ACE studies, which is the adverse childhood experiences studies, right? Which is like a list of 10 things that, trauma, the questions are, there's 10 questions. If you say yes to one question, you get a point. It's not a great point. I will tell you why in a second. You add your points, and out of 10, if you have an ACE score of 3 or more, you are like more likely to have a lot of diseases, right? That's basically the gist of it. And the questions are like, did you experience violence in your home? Did your parents use drugs in your home? Did you witness, were your parents like mentally ill? Questions like this, right? And 10 questions. I have a document that I'll share later, and it's in there if you ever want to look at it. Trigger warning, it's a little heavy to look at. Don't do the ACE studies for yourself alone. But in Philly, they did the Philly ACE studies where there's those questions, and then there's more questions. There's like, did you experience poverty as a child? Did you experience racism? Did you experience blah, 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 right? And overwhelmingly, what we are seeing is that in Philadelphia, most people have experienced some like pretty severe structural like issues in their life. Most people have experienced violence. I've like witnessed violence. I've been like the victim of violence. And those things have an impact on the way we then interact with the world, right? And maybe I'll stop here.
Yeah, for sure. Those cycles of trauma continue until there's an intervention, and that's, I believe, what both of us are trying to do in our work every day, and a lot of other people out here. But these forces are powerful, and they're everywhere. Just to give a quick example of what Noam was talking about in terms of individual responsibility versus structural lack of responsibility, to be honest, is that most of the cases we've been getting lately of young people who've been arrested are for auto theft,
as one of the essay
of Kias and Hyundais, because of a TikTok challenge. So there are all these videos on TikTok and YouTube of how to steal these cars with a USB cord, which is all possible because these two car companies decided to take a shortcut to save some money. So this thing was discovered, it was put out there. Young kids are doing this all across the country and getting arrested for it left and right, unsurprisingly. But yet, they're being held accountable, to use what the system uses. But Kia doesn't have to be accountable. Hyundai doesn't have to be accountable. TikTok doesn't have to be accountable. And YouTube does not have to be accountable. It's only the young, poor, Black and brown kids who ever have to be accountable. So I keep this in mind as I work with my youth. I do want them to understand that hurting people is not okay, and that when we hurt people, we should do our best to try to repair that to the extent possible. but I also know very well what they're up against and how hard their lives are. So I try to balance those two things as much as possible. You know, there are endless needs of all the young people and all the families I work with every day. Just housing needs, employment needs, food insecurity, a lot of issues in school. A lot of the young people that we serve aren't going to school currently for a variety of reasons. You know, just violence in the school, got in trouble, are trying to get transferred. I had one mother tell me that she called the school to let them know that her son was being threatened. He had gotten into a fight. The other boys said that they were going to shoot him if he comes back to school. She went and talked to the principal, and the principal told her to keep him at home. He said, let him do the rest of the year at home, and we'll mark him present. That was their solution. So this is what's going on. While it's important to get these charges dismissed so they can go on with their lives without the stain of a criminal record or the trauma of having spent any time in a cage, it all means really little if everything else around them continues to stay the same way. So we try our best to find out what the needs are and provide them and their families with as many resources as possible to get them into a better situation.
Yeah. I think that I agree with all of this, right? Obviously, I feel like maybe what I should name is that Felix and I work with pretty much the same population, except I get to work with people over the age of 18. But you know, no offense to anybody who's under 25 in the room right now, but a 19-year-old and a 17-year-old, they still don't have their prefrontal cortex developed, so they don't understand the consequences of their actions most of the time. And you know, I think that like one thing that I do want to say is that, you know, I work with people who carry guns, and I'm very aware of the harm that guns are causing in our city. And I don't want anybody in this room to be under the impression that I want to minimize that harm. You know, I live in West Philly. I'm very aware of all of this. But what I will say is like what I've found really, really interesting working with this specific population with the specific charge is that, you know, sometimes we tend to believe that young Black men are maybe tougher than they are, and that the reasons why they carry a gun is different than what it is. And most of those kids have PTSD. And I'm just going to name that right there. And that most of those kids are carrying a gun because they're actually scared of being shot themselves. Is it the best idea in the world to carry a gun? Absolutely not. I will be the first one to tell our participants that, you know, having a gun in a situation of potential violence actually is not a great move. But I will give like a very concrete example of like some ways that our people have learned progressively some of like some abolitionist strategies that I find like kind of fascinating, to be honest. We've started seeing this trend at the center where people will call me in the middle of the night when they're experiencing violence themselves. So they know that I'm like a safe person, and they know that they can tell me things that are happening in their life in a way where there will be no like systems involved. And they also know that I'm good at my job. And so what I've seen happen regularly is that people who are in situations where there is a gun that's being pulled on them, or there is somebody who's coming to jump them, they will call me, put me on speakerphone. And I'm not joking, that has happened many times. they will put me on speakerphone and make me de-escalate the situation in that moment, because they understand, like, we're in this moment where people have started to understand that, like, I don't want to be like escalating this. I actually want to get out of this. I want to figure out a way for this situation to be diffused. And so the people have come up, I have never told somebody to call me when they're being like, when they're getting their ass whooped, for me to deal with that on a phone. And yet people have found this strategy for themselves, which I think is like a really interesting, like, model that has developed on its own. And people, my voice as like a non-Black person on the phone usually de-escalates the situations really quickly, right? Usually, like, people hear and, like, they're like, this is Miss Noam, this is my social worker, and suddenly things just like calm down, and people are able to escape and make like safety plans for themselves, and like, then we will deal with the aftermath. But I just want to name this thing, that most of the time people who are carrying guns in this city in this moment, their kids were like terrified. Some of them, it's like they're working a corner and they need a gun because that's part of like the job. But most of the time it's like kids were like terrified. And that terrifies me, because somebody who's like scared who has a gun is somebody who scares me personally. Right. Yeah, I'll stop here for now.
I have plenty of follow-up questions, but I do want to honor the chat. We have a question from Caitlin. And she says, as a practitioner, or as practitioners of healing justice and restorative justice, what have your experiences been with people who are skeptical of your work? And do you have insights on how to counter the narrative of retribution or punishment as justice?
Well, Caitlin, hi. I feel like you are aware that maybe I've like experienced some pushback on some of the ways that I work. At this point, though, I think that for me, I'm in a space where I work I work for Penn. We have a research IRB situation. We have data. And at this point, I can tell you that the numbers of my diversion program, we've graduated 150 people out of that. And I think we had 4 people who got rearrested after having their charge dismissed in the last 2 years. And that, in terms of numbers, you don't really see numbers like this. Kids were like, and when I say kids, I should maybe be clear that everybody's grown, right? And there's people who are in their 30s and 40s, etc., right? But in terms of numbers, when I'm looking at what I'm doing, it's working. That I know. I've always known that, but now I have numbers to prove it. And so usually when people disagree with me on the basis of like what I'm doing, maybe this is a great time to bring up the fact that currently on State Road, we have the jail system in Philly. We have close to 5,000 people in the jail, which is like a huge like number, like going up from, what we saw during the pandemic. And currently, I was looking at it like earlier because I was doing a training. 91% of the people on State Road are people of color. 73% of them are Black men. So as far as I'm concerned, right, the system is not doing a good job. They're failing at what they're doing. I feel like in my little pocket with my like 2 social workers that I'm supervising and like our team of therapists, we're doing a good job. So if somebody wants to argue with me, I don't know. Maybe they need to prove to me that what they're doing is working,
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I would take it a step further and say that the system is not failing at all, that it's doing exactly what it's created to do. It's doing it well. And it has been for a long time, which is part of the problem. It is a hard sell to people who've been conditioned to see cops, courtrooms, and cages as synonymous with justice. We see it everywhere we look. It's all we know. But the truth is, the penitentiary is 200 and something years old. This hasn't always been how we do things. And so before the Western world came and colonized the people that were here, they were figuring out other ways to deal with harm that I believe were much more effective. But I do understand that people who are surrounded in violence and who are fearful every day legitimately want to see something done about it. But the problem is there aren't many options out there. The two choices we currently have when a harm is committed to us, is done to us rather, is call the cops or do nothing. And the truth is, the vast majority of people do nothing. So this system that claims to be, the enforcer, the protector, whatever, isn't doing a good job of that in terms of sheer numbers. It's just not getting it done. And if incarceration and more police was the answer, I think Rikeyah put it good in her intro. United States would be the safest country in the world. And Philadelphia would definitely be the safest city on the planet, given the amount of police and incarceration that takes place here. So I'm willing to talk about this with whoever. My neighbors, can't see a world without prisons or with less police. I try to have these conversations with them. In my job, I have to talk with people who were harmed in these different cases and try to get them to see the value in a restorative justice process and try to get them to participate because it's their choice. They could say no. And lately, they've all been saying yes. For like, we're on a nice little streak of about the last 10 or so cases where they've said yes. And this is what people want. I answer all the questions. I explain the process to them. I describe to them what their role will be as an active participant in the justice process, instead of just being on the sideline and called on by the district attorney to testify when it's time to testify and then tossed to the side afterwards. Here, they're actually going to sit down across the person who hurt them and tell them about that hurt, however they feel is most important for them. And they'll get to have a say in what actually happens and what the young person has to do. When we finish these circles where this exchange takes place, we usually end with a round of takeaways. And without fail, the takeaways are always, I feel relieved, I feel light, I feel like a burden was lifted off me, I feel hopeful. And I always sit there and think to myself, had this case gone the other way, no one would be feeling any of these things. They'd be feeling the complete opposite. They'd be feeling frustrated, angry, unsatisfied, all those things. So it's about, continuing to do the work, continuing to show it. I'm glad that you have all that evidence. We're currently working on a report that'll be out in about 2 years to document Healing Futures successes. So far, not a single young person who has gone through our program has been rearrested. That's a 0% recidivism rate. And I'm not saying recidivism is the only measure of success. It's not even a good one when you count everything else that goes into why people get arrested and go in and out of the system. But the system can't say anything like that. Theirs is 2/3 and has been since the inception of the first penitentiary. There hasn't been a single year when the recidivism rate has not been 2/3. What company do you think would be able to continue existing with the 2/3 failure rate?
Yeah, and sorry, and I think that I do want to mention that often when we're working with young people, for me, success sometimes looks like somebody surviving, and I really want to name that. I can tell many stories like this. I'll probably pick one, which is, this kid who he was in his 20s, just had a child, and one of his traumas was that his dad went to jail after before his second birthday, right? His dad went to jail for 20 years. I'm exaggerating, 15 years. And that was his trauma, right? He didn't grow up with a dad. He grew up with his grandparents. And then his dad came out of jail. And his dad was still involved in a lot of dumb shit, right? On the block, and just continuing the life that he had before. And this kid had a child, and his big dream was, I want to have the most beautiful birthday party for my kid's first birthday. I want to be there, and I will never leave my kid. I don't want to go to jail. He got caught with his gun case, right? He was selling weed, nothing that was I don't know. I'm going to say there's plenty of dispensaries where people buy weed and they get a salary. I have no moral judgment of a kid selling weed. But my job was to get him to be stable enough, and B, to stop selling weed, because that would get him in trouble. If he got arrested for selling weed, he would be kicked out of my program by the DA's office, just to be completely clear. And while we're in the middle of the program, his dad was killed on the block. His dad was killed. And the first thing that this kid, what went through his mind was I want to hurt the person who did that, right? And but at the same time, he also wanted to be there for his kid. And so that meant that for weeks, we were on the phone constantly talking about it and constantly processing, so that he could move away from this desire for retribution, so that he could break that cycle in his family, right? And that he could actually grieve the death of his father without himself killing somebody, right? And the system will never be able to capture those stories, right? Because that doesn't fit in a box. And because I don't want to tell them those stories, and because that kid cannot tell them those stories safely without then being at risk of being arrested for that, right? And that's just a reality of often the things that we're dealing with, is that, just to name it very plainly, there is no truth in a court of law. That is impossible because of the way it's designed, right? If you actually tell the truth about what happened, you're going to be punished for it, right? So everybody has to tell this pretty neat story that they bring in front of a judge, and and that's what happens. But in the reality of humans, we are complex human beings who have all of us have really dark sides, and we have really beautiful sides, and those always coexist for all of us, regardless of if we're acting on our dark sides or not, right? That is just a thing. But there is this reality that for a lot of the people that we're working with, and for a lot of young people in Philly, a lot of poor young Black men, there is this thing where they have been so exposed to so much violence. That kid that I'm talking about, he was smoking weed 24/7 because all of his friends had died. He was 21 or 22. Every single one of his friends had been killed at some point, right? And so those kids are just thinking about that, right? And that's a reality for a lot of those young people. They're seeing people die. They're seeing their families being destroyed by poverty. And they have to navigate that. And I'm not saying that that's just to be clear, I'm not being let's excuse this. But in trauma theory, instead of saying what's wrong with you, we ask the question, what happened to you, right? And in those situations, when I think about what happened to you, it helps me understand what shaped the people that we're working with. And again, what then happens is that we're trying really hard to keep young people alive and not either dead or in a jail cell, right? Or on probation. I saw somebody mention that in the chat, and I do want to like answer that question. Yeah, when people are on probation, probation is a trap, right? We've known that forever. When somebody's on probation, you know, they are gonna get caught. Probation is designed to do that. I feel like Philly, you know, there's a few things that are like a little easier these days, but when I started in this job, right, people were getting detainers for smoking weed, and everybody was on state road for smoking a blunt, right, and having a dirty urine, and that was the reality of probation. This is a little different now, but it's still a reality that like if we had somebody surveilling us 24/7, all of us here, we would be caught doing things that we shouldn't be doing, period. But though, you know, when you're a young person specifically, you know, the way probation works is that if you're under 30, you're considered high risk, and high risk is high risk of killing or being killed, right? And so that means that you have extra scrutiny. So that means that you get like the youth worker who comes to your house, and you get the weekly supervision, and you get the blah, 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 right? And it's this constant like demand of you being surveilled. So I do want to name that. Can I also address another question in the chat? Robin, you were asking a question about rape specifically. Maybe I'll start by saying that I'm a survivor of being raped at the age of 9. So that's something that I don't want you to think that I'm dismissing. And transformative justice, the way transformative justice like is thought about was at first through the lens of specifically child sexual abuse. So there is this group that's called Generation 5 that like the goal of Generation 5 was to eliminate child sexual abuse in 5 generations, right? And so there is this thing that's really complicated with the models that we're bringing tonight that I want to name, which is that we have to hold the reality of the present, right? Of like somebody was harmed really horribly and will for the rest of their life have to deal with this. And then the long view of like, this is the collective liberation that we're trying to get towards. And those don't have to be in contradiction, but we have to hold them at the same time, right? And that often that means that like in our desire to get towards collective liberation, we're going to have to compromise a little bit on our ideals in order to support somebody who has been harmed. So I do want to name that, right? I don't think, you know, when we're thinking about transformative justice and like thinking about like changing the whole world, sometimes it feels so impossible, right? Because there's a real person who's really hurting and who has been really harmed. I can tell you what happened to the person who raped me, which is that they went to mental health services. And that was what happened to them. They were mandated by the courts in France, very different, whatever. But that is what happened. I think that in the United States specifically, the way that like sexual assault is being dealt with in the systems is horrifying. I don't think that it's helping anybody. But I can share those resources with you if you want to look into that. And I think that there's some really interesting questions that are being posed there because they are dealing with this question, right? Of like, what do we do in the moment? What do we do in the long view of wanting to end sexual assault, right?
Yeah.
And I see you raising your hand. So
Yeah,
I think,
and I have a 7 p.m. commitment, but I will watch the video. But I just want to say, but when I fully believe in prison abolition, you know, I can't even use polite words for what I think about how it is right now in the US. At the same time, in 23, 24, 25, when these things happen, what are the first steps that can be taken within the system as it is now that acknowledge the harm that was done? You know, and when we talk about recidivism with adolescents, that might be very, very different from some other individuals.
Yeah.
We know you have to leave, Robin, but I really appreciate these questions. Would would love to.
No problem, because my
So-
goal is to be able to have the hard, tough conversation with
Yeah.
the people who think this is all, excuse my French, bullshit and appalling.
Yes.
So I really think that needs to be, very explicitly addressed. So this happened to my niece a number of years ago,
Mm.
but if it happened this weekend, what do we here in Chester County say, where I live?
Yeah.
What happens next? And because that's what people need to hear. What are the
Yeah.
steps from the shitty system we have now?
Mm.
And it's going to be better in 5 generations. Real
Yeah.
blueprint.
Yes.
No, that
Thank you for the work you do, Felix. And Noam, nice to meet you. And Felix,
Yeah,
you
you
don't
too.
remember me from Norristown, but I remember you. Bye, everybody.
but that's a very legit question. And I'm glad that Robin asked that to us. Truth is, we live in a hyper violent and hyper sexualized society, where we're bombarded with all of this every single day in so many aspects of our lives, and then punished when we act that way. Most of the people who commit sexual harms have experienced those at some point in their lives. So it's just a cycle that continues. And then the system comes in and inflicts more harm as a way of dealing with people who have caused harm. And, that cycle continues. Yes, it's important to think about the immediate. And sometimes people who hurt other people need to be separated from them for a while. I do believe that, but does it have to be throwing them in a cage and dehumanizing them and acting violent towards them? Absolutely not. We know that doesn't work, and we have to have ways to keep people safe, but to also get other people what they need to stop doing these things. My heart really goes out to Robin and everyone who's experienced anything like that or any harm in general. But we need to keep working towards the world that we want to see. We can't just say, since this can't happen tomorrow, we shouldn't pursue it at all. And we should continue doing what we're doing. That'll keep us stuck in the place where we are.
Yeah, and I want to name that like queer communities for a very long time develop strategies to deal with specifically sexual assault, right? And like that there's like transformative justice is that model, right? How do we, there's 2 things that need to happen. How do we center the needs of the person who was harmed, right? And that's really important in their healing. And then there's the second question, which is, how do we prevent the person who harmed them to harm somebody again? And there's many ways of dealing with that. I could talk to you about transformative justice, but usually what it would look like is to create pods of like, a group of people supporting the person who has been harmed. And there is the part that's sometimes a little tricky, but that I also want to name, that the vast majorities of crimes of of violence in the United States are committed by people who know you. So often being able to, it's usually very possible to know who the person is and to have them also have a group of people who are holding them accountable and who are also following the asks of the person, of the survivor, right? For example, in queer communities, it's very common to have somebody who's not allowed in events because they have harmed somebody else. And that is the demand of the person who has survived harm. They're like, this person cannot come to events. And that is something that is being respected and that people in the community feel empowered to make happen. And often I think that the thing that's really difficult with prison and the system, the criminal justice system and all that is that, and we saw that in 2020, right? When everybody was like, prison abolition, defund the police. And everybody was like, okay, so who do we call when there's a crime? Well, here's the bad news. Prison what it does, like the whole criminal justice system is like a way of like kind of like pushing an issue away, right? I just outsource the problem. There's cops who show up and then the person is gone and I don't have to deal with it. The reality is, like in models that we're talking about, right? A big part of it is that like the community has to be part of it, right? We have to be part of the solution, and we have to be part of like supporting survivors and also helping people grow and change. And that's just a reality that like in a world where there's no prison, we cannot outsource our problems anymore. And to be fair, in Philly, we don't really outsource our problems anyways, because they're on our doorstep most of the time, right? But it's like feeling empowered to deal with them as a collective, as a community.
Felix, is there anything you want to speak to that before? I want to actually ask Robin's question out loud because we are recording, and I want to make sure that there's context given to the answers that were just given. And then from there, I have another question, but I want to allow you to finish any thought that you have on this right now.
No, you can go ahead.
Okay, so just for anyone who might have lost it in the chat, and again for the recording purposes, Robin's question reads, moving into the realm beyond the kinds of issues discussed thus far, as an aunt of someone who has survived a brutal rape and attempted murder, who was an adult, not a teenager, what can we sketch out as a good way for the system to handle something like that? And I think that the in parentheses quoted, it says, setting aside for the moment all of the systemic forces of oppression which contribute to the individual's actions. And so that's the part that I kind of want to uplift, that idea that we can, right? And Noam, you kind of spoke into that, right? Like being able to hold space for two things at once. The idea, I feel like the system kind of programs us to not take the whole picture into account, right? And we want to think about what was done to the person. Again, we want to think about the harm that was caused. We want to label people as offender and perpetrator. And then it's like taboo to even allow yourself to consider what may have happened to this person, right? Like, and we hear the term often, hurt people. Newly, right, we're starting to hear people say things like heal people. So I was just wondering if each of you could like speak deeper into why we can't separate someone's lived experiences, even if they have caused harm, again, not to excuse them, but why it is essential to actually take that into account when we're talking about healing justice and restorative justice.
Okay. You want to get us started, Felix?
Yeah, it's essential to understand the situation and what happened and why it happened. There's really no way forward without that foundation, and you know that context is really important. The court processes don't have any space for that. It's just an assembly line of getting people through and to their cages as fast as possible. Restorative justice and these other forms of justice that we're talking about are intentional about creating that kind of space where those stories can come out. A quote I really love, and I hope I get it somewhat right, is something to the effect of, an enemy is someone whose story I've yet to hear. And what restorative justice does is it puts people face to face, and when you look another human being in the eye, it's hard not to recognize their humanity. So what happens is the system does everything it can to keep people apart. And so while we're apart, we start developing these images and ideas of who the other person is, and those become our reality. And we walk around with those ideas in our heads, and often they're not accurate at all. When you sit across from someone and hear their story, you start to understand, why things happened, and from that place, people can move forward. Incarceration keeps everyone stuck in the moment of the harm, and I mean everyone. There's no moving forward. We see commutation hearings in front of the Board of Pardons, where the family members of people who were killed are still holding on to that 30, 40 years later. It's as if it just happened. If that's not an indictment on the system, I don't know what is. A system that keeps people locked in these in this kind of pain for decades, and I would even say for generations. It gets passed on. Is not our friend, to say the least. So I'm a firm believer that context is important. It's not an excuse. It needs to be expressed, explored, addressed, all of those things before we can move forward.
Yeah, I think that well, I'll say this. I used to teach a trauma class at Phoenix, at SCI Phoenix, where actually Felix and I would bump into each other in the hallway when he would be going to his Inside Out class. I designed this class, which was a 6-month course. It was at the request of a lifers organization, which was trauma and reentry. And the idea was to help men, because it's Phoenix, so it's all men, understand trauma better as they prepare for their reentry, right? And so it's like a college course. We did some really intense reading and some real deep dive into the reality of trauma. And one of the things that we did talk about a lot is this concept in neuroscience, which is brain plasticity. Is the idea that our brain is malleable and can change throughout our life. So the very quick and dirty is that trauma changes the way our brain is wired. And so biologically speaking, there are things that are much harder for us to access when we have experienced a lot of trauma. But what we know now is throughout our life, we can actually reprogram the wiring of our brain. Very quick and dirty. If you want to know more, happy to talk about it. In those classes that I would teach, the number one question that men in prison would ask me across the board, it would come up every single time. Is there a time, is there a way where your brain has been too damaged for you to be able to heal? And that was the question that I would be asked every single time. And even as we would go through it, people would kind of be like, wait, you're saying I still can heal? Are you sure? Because the reality is that people had been told for so long, that they were, the words that they use in prison, like psychopath and sociopath. And everybody was like, what's a psychopath? What's a sociopath? That was their thing. But the reality is again, we hold multiple truths at the same time. Somebody can have done something horrible, heinous, however bad it is. That person can also have been really hurt in their lifetime. And those two things are true at the same time. And I think that I have a lot of frustrations about American society as an immigrant, and one of them is this idea that we can only be one thing and not multiple things. And I do think that the great news is that I'm seeing the question in the chat about, is there something that we can do to address this violence as community members, as taxpayers? What can we do? The great news is that every single system in the United States is so fucked up that you can literally pick any lane, like food justice, housing justice, health justice, whatever you want, and just chip away at it. And you're going to help break the system of violence in this country, right? Like every single one of these systems, they are like interconnected, and they're all participating to the violence of the United States. I feel like I can probably dig that and put that in the documents I'll share with you. This guy from like, who was at Rikers, I think, Eddie Ellis, he did that study where he put like the map. Do you know what I'm seeing you smirk, Felix? So I think that you know what I'm talking about, where it's like the maps of like New York, of Brooklyn, where it was like the comparison of like looking at like the incarceration rates of New York versus like the public health data of New York, and actually how like they're the same map, right? Or it's like the thing about like how in poor neighborhoods in the US there's no trees, right? So you can literally like kind of like overlap the map of like trees in the US and the maps of incarceration, and like you can see that like the map where there's no trees is the same as like the one where there's a high incarceration rate, right? Like all of this is connected. I know it makes me sound like a mad scientist, but actually it is all connected.
Yeah. And look, there's no question about what causes crime, or where crime happens most. There's mountains of research and data and our own common sense that tells us that crime is connected to poverty. If we can address that, right, we live in a much safer society, and we can. It's just a matter of priority. A fraction of the U.S. $835 billion a year war budget can go to making sure everyone has health care. The U.S. just gave Israel $105 billion. How many people's lives could have been improved with that money here? So it's not like a mystery. Like there shouldn't be any question about how do we fix this, but it's just a matter of doing it. And for some reason, there are just too many hands in the pot, and people don't want to let go of power, and there's a lot of greed and a bunch of other things that prevent us from giving people the kind of help that they need.
Oh, sure. Pascal is asking if they can unmute to ask a question. Please do. Feel free.
Thanks, Rikeyah. Hey, everybody. So I work with Good Shepherd and for a program where we're recruiting youth to become facilitators and circle keepers under the restorative justice framework. And I was in front of a group of high school kids this week, and I was kind of giving my pitch, kind of talking about RJ. A lot of them hadn't heard of it. Some of them were vibing and really excited about the idea. But I had this one boy who asked me if he joins the program, can he get a badge that says simp on it? Which to me was sort of kind of getting at the sort of cultural kind of suppression of boys' experience of showing vulnerability and getting kind of connected with their feelings, which honestly I can really relate to. But I was wondering, next week I'll be in front of a bunch of kids who are doing a diversion program, and just wondering if y'all have really any advice about framing and sort of reckoning with the kind of idea of like RJ being soft on crime or like soft altogether, and how I might, sort of speak to that sort of cultural kind of imposition on these young boys.
Yeah. Pascal?
Nailed it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that question. Thanks for the important work you do. I know of Good Shepherd and appreciate, all of it. Prison does a really good job at causing pain, but doesn't really hold people accountable, which I talked about earlier. someone can do a year, a decade, multiple decades in a cage and never once have to think about the harm they caused. You know, restorative justice forces you to deal with that harm. And by force, I don't mean in a way that's you know, it's an empowering process, or it attempts to be anyway. But I would argue that prison is soft on crime, while restorative justice is tough. You know, if we're using that language, to sit in front of the person you hurt and look them in the eyes and listen to vivid details of the impact of your actions is tough. And then to apologize. I have to help the young people who I work with craft apology letters. They write them, and my team and I give feedback. But that's hard. You know, most adults in this world don't like apologizing and never do. You know, so to ask a young person to do that is, or for young people to do that is especially impressive for me. But you know, that's what I would say in response. You know, this is the hard route, the hard route, and the hard route is what's going to get us to healing and to transformation and to growth, whereas the other way stunts all of those things.
And I would argue, you know, I don't know the situation and I don't know the kid and your relationship with that person, but I would argue that you don't reach vulnerability with people unless they feel safe and in a trusting environment. And so asking for people to like show their wounds before they know that it's safe is, I would argue, dangerous actually to be doing. You know, there's this idea in like trauma theory that's pretty important for us practitioners to never assume ourselves to be a safe person. And so, and that means that consistently working towards that. And I do feel like, if I'm being honest, if I was 14 and somebody asked me if I wanted to be a facilitator of a restorative justice group, I would tell them that shit is corny. Like, it would take me a lot of relationship building to get to that place of being okay doing it. Like, if I'm being completely honest, I was a nightmare 14-year-old, but if I'm being completely honest, like, you know, a lot of like the work is in the relationship building, right? And like, for me, that's like the most important thing. And I can say that all day, like, everything that we do is relationships. If we don't have relationships, we can't, you know, we can't do our work. And that's how we're going to change the world, is through relationships. And so, you know, I actually understand why this kid would say that. But like, at the same time, you know, I've been working with some of my clients for like, you know, at the center, we don't have like a, there, you know, it's like, we don't dismiss people. So people like voluntarily come to us like outside of our diversion program. And some people I've been working with for 5 years, like weekly conversations. And I will say that one of the big things that has been happening, and like, I'm talking more like, those are more like grown men, you know, 40s, 50s, 60s. And what I do see is that like, in that relationship of developing secure attachment and like trust and relationship building, in case you haven't figured that out yet, I'm a pretty straight shooter. So if somebody says something like sexist or like dumb, I will just tell them. And you know, I've been working with men for 5 years who like are developing their emotional intelligence in a way that I would never believe was possible, right? And like, I do believe that a lot of my work is to actually like unravel toxic masculinity with them, right? And the number of times I say toxic masculinity in a day is like absurd, right? But that's actually like part of like the violence, obviously, right? When I'm saying people are traumatized and they're taking guns, it's also because like they don't know better strategies to deal with their PTSD, right? And the reason why they don't have better strategies to deal with their PTSD is because most of the time they are men and they've been told that like, you got to be tough, right? You can't be soft. and like then they just do dumb shit, right? And it's kind of that cycle. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's really helpful.
Y'all are having an amazing conversation. I do want to uplift something else that came from the chat. And it actually is a question that I had as well. Are there ways that we can just because the conversation has been like heavily focused on harm causer. And in the chat there is a question that asks, are there ways that we can talk about addressing how harm is repaired? And I know Felix has specific thoughts about harm repair. So please do share on that. But also, in what ways can healing justice and restorative justice appeal to the needs and support for the people who have been impacted by violence? Because I do think that that's something that we should uplift, right? Like, how are we also considering and working on, again, creating that space for the person who was harmed, and making sure that their needs are taken into consideration here as well.
Yeah. Thank you to whoever put that in the chat, and thank you, Rikeyah. Yeah, restorative justice centers the needs of the people harmed. As you mentioned earlier, Rikeyah, the 3 guiding questions of restorative justice are: who has been harmed, what are their needs, and whose obligation is it to address these? I know in my program, you know, we invite the people harmed to come in. We do a full needs assessment with them if they're open to that, and then try to get them as many resources as possible. You know, it starts there, because you know they're the ones who are hurt. But you know, yeah, that's how I would answer that. Restorative justice certainly focuses on that first and foremost.
You know, I don't work that often with people who are actively in a situation where they have just harmed somebody, right? I either work with people who have spent a lot of time in prison and are coming home, or people who are like, you know, like carrying a gun with no victim. It's like, we could argue that there's a larger societal harm, but there's not like a direct victim to the things that people are dealing with. However, I know we've said this before, but I'm gonna push it again. Most of the people that I work with who are considered to be like perpetrators of harm are people who have like experienced like tremendous amounts of harm themselves. I'm thinking like we have one of our participants in our groups, and one of his son got killed, the other one is in jail. Every week he calls me telling me about somebody else in his neighborhood who has died. And this is a grown man who just cries on the phone weekly, you know. And like when I say a grown man, I mean like a grown North Philly man who does not want to cry because he thinks that makes him really soft, and who cries all the time on the phone because like there is just so much violence in his neighborhood that is like the constant churning of death. And so I do want to name that, and like that, like sometimes, you know, we want to create this story of like there's like a bad person and a good person, something bad happened to the good person because the bad person did something. But I think that like if we try to like look not just at that tree but at the whole forest, when we start realizing how the fabric of our city is just like constant pain and harm, it's easier for us to understand that like people, like, you know, it's like it's a bigger thing, right? It's like almost like a vibrating pain throughout the city. And so it's a little bit more complicated than like we have one person who has been harmed and we're gonna like take care of them, which is great, and we need to do that, absolutely. But also that there is like the zooming out thing of like you know, of like looking at the whole picture. And that's a little trickier to do because again, it forces us to hold multiple realities at once, right? Proud North Philly dude, his son is in prison for murder. He himself got to me through like a parole mandate, whatever. And also he lost his son, right? And all those realities are true at the same time. And that's a little bit more complicated to deal with.
Yeah, when restorative justice, as the current field that it is, emerged back in the 70s, it was in response to what some people thought were weaknesses in the criminal legal system. And as a result, they adopted the victim offender language, which has been omnipresent in the restorative justice lexicon ever since. I personally reject those labels. My program doesn't use them. It creates this false binary that leads people to believe that there are two categories of folks in this world, good people and bad people. And good people need to be kept safe out here, and bad people need to be put away. But the truth is that the potential to do good things and bad things lies in everyone. And good and evil cuts through the heart of every single human being. And people on either side of a crime equation are typically the same people in the same neighborhoods, experiencing the same traumas, or even are living in the same house. You know, so we take a more nuanced approach, appreciate and explore all of the messiness that is in being human, and take all of that into consideration. You know, so sometimes it is important to distinguish, you know, who hurt who, if that's the situation. Sometimes it goes both ways, but it's also important to acknowledge that it's never that clear cut. It's hardly ever, you know, simple like that. And we've had situations in my program where once we start finding out the details of what really happened, there's accountability to be had on both sides. And I've facilitated several restorative community conferences where both sides ended up apologizing to each other. That could never happen in the criminal punishment system. There has to be one and there has to be the other. And without that dichotomy, the system would absolutely crumble. It just would cease to exist. That is essential to the criminal punishment system. And RJ and Healing Justice and TJ don't look at it that way.
I see one more question in the chat that I want to uplift that looks like it's specifically for Noam, an interest in you being called in the middle of the night to diffuse situations. And the question is there something that or a way to scale or something? Wait, is there something that can scale, or is there something that is unique to you and the relationships that you have built?
Okay. Maybe I'll start by saying this. I am not an exceptional human being by any means. I just found a lane that is a good lane for my skills and what I'm good at doing. So I'm gonna name that, because I think that sometimes there is, you know, this idea of like the pedestal or whatever. And so I was telling this story to Rikeyah actually recently. I don't believe in scaling up anything. I think that we all need to find like a million, and like that's the Miriam Kaba idea of like a million experiments and like all find our ways to like do our thing. But the story that I was telling Rikeyah last week is in Maryland, there's the Harriet Tubman National Park. And I went there like maybe 2 years ago. And one of the things that I learned there that I keep like going back to and I talk about all the time is that Harriet Tubman freed people in either her family or in the immediate circles of like people that she knew. And the reason why she was able to do that is because she has like very, very deep knowledge of the landscape, of the waters, specifically of the swamps, the plants, and she was able to navigate through a landscape because she knew it really, really well. And she wasn't trying to like take everybody with her, but she was very strategic about taking people who were close to her through a landscape that she knew. And the reason why this keeps sticking up with me so much is because sometimes I think that like when I'm thinking about this work, the work of like restorative justice, transformative justice, healing justice, however we not want to call it, trauma healing, I really deeply believe that it's work that needs to be done really deeply and really narrowly. Like if each one of us is able to develop like really deep relationships in landscapes where we're really familiar with what we're doing, this is when we're the most effective. I cannot do this work in another setting than what I'm doing right now. The reason why a kid is calling me at fucking 11 p.m. at night is because he trusts me, because of the relationship that we built and the depth of that relationship. And so I think that like for all of us, and that's like maybe my call to action, however you want to call it, it's like, and this is what I teach social workers when I train them. It's like, what are your specific skills? What are the things that you're really good at? That like, what makes you you, specifically you, and how can you utilize this in your narrow and deep lane? It doesn't have to be like 10,000 people that you're gonna like help do whatever. Like if Harriet Tubman didn't do that, no offense, none of us are Harriet Tubman. So let's relax and like scale down, right? But like, let's try to do this as deeply as possible, because I will tell you this, that there's kids, my phone number has been the same for the last decade since I moved to the US. I have kids that I've worked with like 7 years ago who still call me because like they're like in this motion of like supporting other people because this has impacted them, because they also want to do something. And we have to trust that if we move deeply and narrowly, we can actually impact people more and they will continue spreading that, right? And so all that to say that like, I want everybody to feel comfortable calling everybody when there's like a horrible situation in their life, right? Like that if you have those deep relationships that you're able to do that and be like, shit, I'm in trouble, right? I usually, the way I think about it and I talk about it with my participants and the way we think about it is like, I always imagine the scenario of like your house is on fire at 2 a.m. 2 a.m, your house is on fire, you're out on the street, you're wearing your jammies if like you wear pajamas, right? But whatever. And you have nothing on you, right? Maybe you have your phone, you left the house with your phone, there's nothing else. Who do you call? And the reality of American society is that most people have nobody to call. That is an actual reality of like the loneliness of American society. And so what I do and what I've been like, you know, monetizing is being that person for people, right? In an ideal world, I don't want to be doing this job. My ideal world involves none of us having nonprofit jobs where we're facilitating this. In my ideal world, we all are doing this for each other, right? And so I do want to name that like, you know, who is it that people can call when the house is on fire? And like, we should all be the person that somebody should call when their house is on fire, right? That like in an ideal dream world. And also I want to have like people that I can call when my house is on fire. And so I think that that's maybe the reframe that I would bring to that. And also like, and it doesn't have to be with strangers either, you know, like I do that for a living. Again, I wish that that was not my job. I wish that nobody had gun cases in Philly. That's like what I want the most in life, you know? But I'll stop there.
Felix, did you want to say something?
I just want to emphasize that relationships are key. That's where everything starts, and building those strong relationships with people creates that kind of trust, creates that kind of vulnerability that we need in order to heal. And so if you're doing that with 2 people or 10 people, you know, make sure that those relationships are deep. I continue to stay in touch with the young people who I work with, even after they finish our program. I still get the calls as well at all times of the day, you know, and I feel honored that like the cousin of someone who went through my program calls me out of nowhere with an employment need, or you know, something, or you know, we've like there are programs in Philly that get people beds, get people coats, like all kind of stuff, you know, and to be in a position to help people with those kind of things is a real blessing.
Thank you both. Looking at the time, we got about 10 minutes left, and I do want to leave a little time at the end to kind of share some resources. Also, Felix and Noam, if you guys feel comfortable sharing your information in the chat, if people want to reach out, please feel free to do that as well. But I do kind of want to anchor us with one last grounding question. And Noam, the last conversation, Noam and Felix, is like a perfect segue to this question. I began this facilitation with, you know, explaining, right, that we currently are operating in a system that tells us what justice is. And Felix, you put it perfectly when you said, oftentimes when harm happens, people are left with two choices. Either we lean into the system that exists or we do nothing. And so I believe wholeheartedly that all of this reimagining and all of this change starts with each one of us as an individual. And so my question for you guys is, how do each of us, if you had like any advice for how we as just human beings, right? Noam, you said, although I kind of challenged this, right? You said you're not exceptional. I think you are. And I think that we all have that opportunity to be exceptional and putting our best foot forward, right? And challenging what we are told is right or what we are told is justice. How do we embody transformative justice, healing justice, restorative justice in our just day-to-day lives, right? If we encounter harm, if we encounter humans who, again, not good or bad people, may just be in a good or bad moment, what are some things that we can keep in mind, and maybe some practices that we can embody for ourselves where we begin to live these principles ourselves?
That's a big ass question for an 8 minutes left in a panel. Okay.
So sorry.
It's all good. It's all good. Felix, you want to go first, or?
Well, the good news about restorative justice is you don't have to be a professional, you don't have to be an academic, you don't have to have years and years of schooling and training. Restorative justice allows the average person, all of us, to be peace builders in our communities, because harm is happening all around us. We're causing harm, we're being harmed, you know. It doesn't have to rise to the level of what's been deemed a criminal act. Restorative justice gives us opportunities to heal those harms in our everyday lives all the time. And it doesn't have to be a specific practice. You know, if I hurt someone, I need to reflect on that, and then I need to go to them and talk about that with them, find out what their needs are and what I need to do to put things more right. At its core, that is what restorative justice is. It's really that simple. And so it gives us all it gives us all the opportunity to do this every day. Really, every day there's opportunities to practice this, and if we continue to do it and get better at it, we'll start to see things change around us.
Yeah. I'm trying really hard to think about how to say something quick, you know. So maybe I will tell you what I teach people that some of our participants, which is like, if I put my trauma lenses on at all times, right? Which helps me actually a lot be in the healing justice world. And when I start asking what happened to you instead of what's wrong with you, the number one thing that it helps me do is not take things personally. And it helps me understand that like people act a certain way because of them and not usually because of me. And in terms of what it looks like for like being in relationship with each other, it allows me to not escalate situations where people are maybe distraught. And that's specifically, I'm thinking about that for like de-escalation. I take DL, I take the bus. I spend a lot of time in spaces in Philly where there's plenty of need for de-escalation, right? And right, that's just, if you live in Philly, we all know that like our shoulders are tight because we're like making sure that everything's all right. And then at the same time, right, there is a need for de-escalation. I will say most native Philadelphians I know are pretty good at de-escalation. But sometimes it does mean, you know, being able to be a grounded presence in a time where people are a little elevated. And to do that, like being able to never personalize what's happening in a situation is really helpful for me. And, you know, obviously I'm a mental health professional, so that's my bread and butter. But in the city of Philadelphia, you can assume that people are traumatized, right? Like I'm always moving from the assumption that everybody is holding a lot of trauma. I know that I can feel it when I walk the streets of Philly. And so that means that like I adapt the way that I'm showing up to that reality, right? And that if somebody is being rude to me, I'm like, it's about them, it's not about me, right? And then I can keep it moving. But also what it allows to do is for like the risk of violence to be really limited by that, right? By the way that I'm showing up. And obviously, I don't need to tell you this, but me being a 5'3" Arab person also shields me from a lot of harm when I navigate the world in comparison to being a Black person in this city. Don't need to say that, but I will, right? In case you thought I wasn't aware. So, yeah, that would be my short answer.
I just want to thank you both so much for a very, what I believe is a fruitful conversation. I do want to leave space if anyone else wants to ask a question. Now is the time.
Not only a question, but I'd love to just hear some
Comments,
comments.
yeah, feedback.
What are people thinking? How are people feeling? Because I think we've talked enough.
Inner city peace. I see you said you would like to add something. You can come off mute if you like.
Yeah, thanks for joining us too.
If not, I'll just read the comment. Oh, the chat is going off. Hold on, I lost it. Inner City Peace says, I believe healing starts with root, stomach, mind, heart, then environment, then the mind can fully begin to redevelop.
Agreed.
And then Katia Perez, hey, thanks for joining us. Says feeling gratitude for this super informative panel. I feel you on that, Katia. And if you guys, everybody, can find your way, like look at the chat. There are some resources being shared there, some websites that you can visit, books, podcasts, and Noam put together a whole document full of readings and website. So please, yes, Christine, please share.
Hi, my name is Christine. I'm from Purple House Project PA, and I just wanted to share that I really appreciated all of the information. Some of it was new information for me. I typically work with women who are impacted by intimate partner violence, and so some of the terms I was aware of, but I definitely learned a lot, and you both did an amazing job. So thank you for sharing so much of yourself.
What was your org's name again?
Purple House Project PA.
Thank you for doing the really hard DV work. I'm aware of the trenches of that specific line of work. So thank you.
All right. Any more thoughts, reflections, feelings? We still have 2 minutes. Guelu. I know you. Thank you so much for this conversation. It was amazing and so helpful in thinking beyond our current systems of violence and what to do now. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you, Guelu, for being here. Luis says this has been a really fantastic talk. Pascal says appreciate everyone. Reverend Jimenez, part of what makes trauma recovery hard for a lot of us is that for it to work, the harm has to stop. And for too many of us, the harm is ongoing. True indeed.
Yeah.
I want to thank everybody for being a part of this discussion tonight. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for your participation. Again, we documented the event, so we are going to send out a follow-up email with the resources if you missed them and the recording. And I'm just so grateful for our panelists, and I'm grateful for everyone who took the time to be here with us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
Ricky. Have a good night. Go Phillies.
Good
They
night.
better win this one. And I will play some mood music as we find our way out.
Hey, what's happening? Brother, what's up? This is a big party, man.